The disappearance of two waitresses from a Nebraska diner in 1983 was dismissed by many as just another case of women running off for a different life. For more than a decade, that was the accepted, albeit cruel, explanation for Martha Mallory and Clara Shaw. But in 1995, a bizarre discovery was made in a warehouse 100 miles away during a demolition project, a heavy wooden barrel that had been sealed for years. The contents revealed the crime wasn't a random act on the interstate, but a calculated abduction by someone who had access to the women and the perfect place to hide what he had done. The grinding whine of the angle grinder against rusted steel was the only sound loud enough to drown out the silence that had defined Ethan Mallory's life for the past 12 years. It was late, past 9 on a Tuesday in October 1995. The shop floor, usually a cacophony of hammers and welding torches, was quiet now, save for Ethan's solitary work. This solitude was preferable. The physical labor, the sheer resistance of the metal beneath his hands, provided a necessary distraction. At 24, Ethan felt older than the calendar suggested, anchored by a past that refused to stay buried. Moving away, going to college, building a future, none of it had happened. Instead, he remained tethered to this stretch of Nebraska prairie by an event that occurred when he was just 12 years old, the night his mother, Martha Mallory, and her colleague, Clara Shaw, vanished from the I-80 truck stop diner. Easing the pressure on the grinder, he let the whining disc slow to a stop. The sudden quiet felt heavy, pressurized. Wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of a greasy glove, Ethan felt the metallic tang of ozone and pulverized dust coating the inside of his throat. 12 years. The ambiguity of it was a slow poison. Had they run off with truckers, as the local rumors cruelly suggested? Had something more sinister happened in the cold Nebraska night? This lack of answers had stalled his life, leaving him drifting between low-wage jobs and sleepless nights, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. He stared at the smooth, raw edge he'd created on the steel beam. It was temporary progress. Inevitably, the silence returned, bringing with it the images he couldn't escape, the turquoise uniforms, the bright smiles in that last photograph, the empty parking lot under the harsh mercury vapor lights. Mallory. The voice cut through the quiet. Ethan turned, lifting his safety goggles onto his forehead. His supervisor, Greg, stood by the office door, gesturing impatiently. Greg's expression was unreadable, obscured by the shadows of the shop. "Yeah?" Ethan shouted back, his voice rough from the dust. "Front office." "Now?" Greg didn't wait for a response, disappearing back into the brightly lit cube. A frown crossed Ethan's face. Greg usually didn't bother him when he was working overtime. Hanging the grinder on its hook, Ethan started walking toward the office, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in his stomach. As he got closer, something made his blood run cold. Greg wasn't alone. Two men were waiting just inside the dusty, fluorescent-lit space. They wore suits, cheap polyester blends that looked out of place against the backdrop of cluttered desks and grease-stained blueprints. They weren't locals. Carrying the stiff, impersonal demeanor of official business, they could only be cops. Ethan stepped into the office. The air conditioning hummed loudly, a stark contrast to the heat of the shop floor. The men watched him approach, their expressions carefully neutral, practiced. Ethan Mallory? The taller of the two stepped forward. He possessed a tired face, etched with deep lines around his eyes and thinning gray hair. He looked like a man who had seen too much and slept too little. "That's me." Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly conscious of the grime under his fingernails, the sweat staining his collar. "I'm Detective Eris Thorne, Nebraska State Patrol. This is Investigator Miller." Thorne gestured to the younger man, who nodded curtly, his eyes scanning the office with restless energy. "We need to speak with you privately." Greg, hovering nervously by the coffee machine, took the hint. "I'll be on the floor, Ethan." Take whatever time you need." He retreated quickly, pulling the door shut behind him. The silence stretched, amplified by the hum of the AC. Ethan's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. State Patrol didn't drive out to Kearney in the middle of the night unless something significant had happened. For 12 years, significant had meant rumors, false sightings, psychics claiming to know where Martha and Clara were, each one a fresh wave of hope, followed by a crushing disappointment. This, however, felt different. The gravity in Thorne's eyes, the late hour, it spoke of something final. "What's this about?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he crossed his arms over his chest defensively. Detective Thorne didn't preamble. He offered no condolences or platitudes. He delivered the news with the sterile precision of a coroner's report, his gaze fixed on Ethan's face. Earlier today, a demolition crew was working on tearing down an old warehouse in Omaha, off Industrial Road. It's been mostly unused for years. During the cleanup of the subcellars, the workers found something. Ethan waited, the metallic taste returning to his mouth. He focused on a crack in the concrete floor, trying to ground himself. "They found a large wooden barrel," Thorne continued, his voice measured, devoid of emotion. "A pickle barrel. It was sealed. Inside, there was a black plastic bag containing human remains." The words hung in the air, suspended in the sterile environment of the office. Remains. It was a word Ethan had both dreaded and longed for. It signaled an end to the ambiguity, the agonizing uncertainty that had plagued him for over a decade. But it also meant the end of hope. The faint, irrational hope that she might have just left, that she might have amnesia, that she might one day reappear. "We ran the dental records," Thorne said, his voice softening slightly, a flicker of sympathy in his tired eyes. "Mr. Mallory, I'm very sorry to inform you, the remains have been positively identified as your mother." The office seemed to tilt, the fluorescent light suddenly too bright, the air too thin. The ambiguity of 12 years crashed into a horrific certainty. It wasn't a trucker. It wasn't a new life in California. It wasn't an accident. It was a warehouse in Omaha, a sealed barrel, a pickle barrel. The grotesque absurdity of it was sickening. Leaning back against a filing cabinet, Ethan felt the cold metal pressing into his spine. He closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just heard. His mother, the vibrant woman who smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, who ruffled his hair and called him kiddo, had spent the last 12 years in the dark, submerged in a barrel in a forgotten cellar. He thought of the last photo he had of her, taken that very night. She was smiling, her arm around Clara, their turquoise uniforms bright against the drab diner backdrop. The image was seared into his memory, a vibrant snapshot of a life brutally interrupted. The silence in the office was absolute now, broken only by the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing. As the initial shock began to recede, it was replaced by a cold, hard reality. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a confirmation of murder. The rumors that she had abandoned him, run off with some trucker, they were finally, definitively silenced. But that silence was replaced by a new, agonizing set of questions. "Where?" Ethan managed, his voice hoarse. "Where is she now?" "She's at the Douglas County Medical Examiner's office in Omaha," Thorne replied. "We'll need you to come down, handle the arrangements, and answer some questions." "We've officially reopened the investigation. This is now a homicide." Ethan nodded numbly. A homicide? The word felt alien, yet entirely expected. The silence that had defined his life hadn't been empty after all. It had been waiting. The drive to Omaha passed in a blur of headlights and endless asphalt. Insisting on going immediately, Ethan left his truck at the fabrication shop and rode with Detective Thorne and Investigator Miller. He sat in the back seat, the vinyl upholstery cracked and sticky, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Staring out the window, he watched the familiar Nebraska landscape transform into something alien and menacing under the pale moonlight. Arrival at the Douglas County morgue occurred just after midnight. The building was squat and imposing, constructed of cold concrete and glass. It radiated a clinical chill that seeped into Ethan's bones even before he stepped inside. In the lobby, the air hung heavy with the smell of industrial disinfectant, a futile attempt to mask the underlying odor of decay. Thorne led him through a series of sterile hallways, the linoleum floors squeaking under their shoes. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional beep of medical equipment. They stopped outside a heavy metal door, the sign next to it reading, "Viewing Room 1." "Ethan," Thorne said, his voice low, "you don't have to do this. The identification has been confirmed by the medical examiner. We don't need a visual confirmation." Ethan shook his head, his throat tight. "I need to—" He needed to see the finality of it, to confront the horror head-on. He couldn't allow his mother's fate to remain an abstract concept, a collection of words spoken in a dusty office. It had to be made real. Thorne nodded understandingly, pushing the door open. The room was small, brightly lit, and colder than the hallway. A stainless steel table dominated the center of the space, where the coroner, a stout woman with a brisk, professional demeanor, stood waiting. Bracing himself, Ethan stepped closer to the table. The reality was sterile and brutal. The intervening 12 years, the nature of the disposal, had done their work. There were no recognizable features, no remnants of the vibrant woman he remembered. Just the clinical evidence of a life ended prematurely. He focused on the details the coroner pointed out, the dental work, the specificities that defined a person in death. He confirmed the identification, the word yes feeling heavy and final on his tongue. Turning away, bile rose in his throat. The image was seared into his mind, a grotesque overlay on the memories of his mother. How did she die? The question was rough, scraping his throat. The coroner hesitated, glancing at Thorne. The cause of death is difficult to determine definitively due to the advanced state of decomposition and the effects of the brine solution, she explained, her voice clinical but compassionate. The salinity of the brine inhibited decomposition significantly, preserving the remains in a remarkable state. However, there is evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. Murdered. Beaten to death. The words echoed in Ethan's mind, each one a fresh blow. Thorne guided him out of the room and into a cramped office down the hall. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the viewing room. Pouring him a cup, black and bitter, Thorne handed it over. Ethan accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into his cold hands. "I know this is overwhelming," Thorne began, settling into the chair behind the desk, "but we need to talk about the evidence found at the scene. It might help us understand who did this." He opened a thick file folder on the desk. Inside were photographs, glossy prints that captured the grim reality of the discovery. Thorne spread them out on the desk. The first few photos showed the warehouse exterior, a dilapidated brick structure, windows boarded up, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Then the interior, dark, cavernous spaces, dust motes dancing in the beams of the work lights. Then came the subcellar. The photos depicted a cramped, damp space with stone walls and a dirt floor. And there it was, the barrel, large, wooden, bound with rusted metal hoops. The wood was dark, stained by time and moisture. The photos chronicled the discovery, workers looking confused, then horrified. The police arrival. One photo stopped Ethan cold, a close-up of the barrel's interior, murky liquid, floating debris that looked like dill or some other herb. Pickles floated on the surface, interspersed with the sprigs of dill. The sight was grotesque, a bizarre juxtaposition of the mundane and the horrific. The final photo was the most disturbing. A gloved hand, encased in black nitrile, reached into the brine, lifting the edge of a heavy black plastic bag. The bag was thick and opaque, sagging under its weight. The image was visceral, clinical, yet profoundly violating. "The plastic bag," Ethan murmured, pointing a trembling finger at the photo. "It looks like a heavy-duty garbage liner." "It is," Thorne confirmed. "Industrial grade, the kind used in commercial kitchens or warehouses." The industrial nature of the disposal, the calculated effort to hide her, to preserve the evidence of the crime, was sickening. This wasn't a crime of passion, a hasty burial in the woods. It was methodical, planned. Someone had access to industrial supplies, a secure location, and the cold-blooded resolve to seal a human being in a barrel of brine. Ethan stared at the image, the reality of his mother's fate settling heavy in his chest. But the discovery also brought a sudden, sharp clarity. If his mother was here, where was the other person who vanished that night? "Clara," Ethan said, looking up at Thorne, his eyes pleading. "Clara Shaw. What about her?" Clara was younger than Martha, barely 20, with bright blonde hair and a quick laugh. Martha had taken her under her wing, treating her almost like a daughter. They were inseparable. Thorne shook his head. "Only one set of remains was found in the barrel, Ethan." There was nothing else in the warehouse indicating Clara Shaw was ever there. Ethan processed this information. The police narrative for years had been that they ran off together, probably with truckers heading west. That narrative was now shattered. His mother hadn't run off. She had been murdered and hidden. So what happened to Clara? A desperate, painful hope ignited in him. If his mother was killed that night, maybe Clara had witnessed it and escaped. Or perhaps the killer took her. Maybe she was trafficked, held captive somewhere. Maybe, against all odds, Clara Shaw was still alive. The thought galvanized him. His grief was momentarily overshadowed by a fierce, burning need for answers. His mother had been fiercely protective of Clara. If there was any chance Clara was out there, Ethan felt an overwhelming obligation to find her. It was the last thing he could do for his mother. "We need to find her," Ethan stated, his voice regaining its strength. "If she wasn't with my mother, someone took her. We need to reopen everything." "We already have," Thorne assured him. "The disappearance of Martha Mallory and Clara Shaw is now officially a homicide investigation. We're going to look at everything with fresh eyes. The technology has advanced significantly since 1983. We have tools now that we didn't have then." Ethan nodded, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The police had failed his mother 12 years ago. They had let the case go cold, dismissed the women as runaways, and allowed the rumors to fester. Relying on them now felt impossible. He looked back at the photos, at the murky brine and the black plastic bag. This was all that was left of his mother, a grotesque secret hidden in plain sight for 12 years. He wouldn't let Clara suffer the same fate. He would find her, or he would find the person who took her. The following days were consumed by a whirlwind of grim formalities. Handling the arrangements for his mother's cremation was a surreal experience that left Ethan feeling detached and numb. The finality of it was crushing, yet the lack of answers, the lingering mystery of Clara's fate, prevented any sense of closure. Returning to Kearney, he found the familiar streets feeling alien and hostile. The fabrication shop, once a sanctuary of noise and distraction, now felt like a cage. He met with Detective Thorne again at the State Patrol headquarters in Omaha. The building was a maze of bureaucratic offices, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and floor wax. Ethan sat in a cramped interview room, the walls covered in acoustic tiles, as Thorne laid out the original case files from 1983. Surprisingly thin, the files were a testament to the lack of progress made at the time. Ethan flipped through the pages, the typed reports blurring together. The investigation had been cursory, superficial, tainted by the assumption that Martha and Clara were runaways. "The timeline is crucial," Thorne began, pointing to a faded report. "Your mother and Clara Shaw were working the late shift at the I-80 truck stop diner. The manager, Bill Thompson, clocked out early, around 10:30 p.m., leaving them to close up." A familiar surge of resentment toward Bill Thompson washed over Ethan. He had always blamed the manager for leaving them alone that night, a careless decision that had set the stage for the tragedy. Oblivious to Ethan's internal turmoil, Thorne continued. Around 10:45 p.m. they served 2 customers, off-duty correctional officers Marcus Foster and Aaron Corbin. This was the last confirmed sighting inside the diner. Foster and Corbin. The names were etched in Ethan's memory. They had been the focus of suspicion for years, the last ones to see them alive. Their involvement had been the subject of endless speculation and rumor, but no charges were ever filed. Ethan pulled the worn photograph from his wallet, the last image of his mother and Clara. He studied their faces, their bright smiles, their matching turquoise uniforms. He remembered the texture of the fabric, the scent of his mother's hairspray, the sound of Clara's laughter. The photograph was a painful reminder of what had been lost, a vibrant snapshot of a life brutally interrupted. At approximately 11 to 11:15 p.m., Thorne said, consulting his notes, witnesses reported seeing them step outside for a smoke break near the dumpsters at the back of the diner. That was the last time anyone saw them. The dumpsters. The image always chilled Ethan. A dark, isolated area behind the diner, the smell of garbage and diesel fumes, the rumble of idling trucks. It was a perfect place for an abduction. The original investigators focused heavily on Foster and Corbin, Thorne explained, leaning back in his chair. 2 men, law enforcement adjacent, last ones to see them. It made sense at the time. They were young, brash, known to frequent the diner, but we never found any concrete evidence linking them to the disappearance. They lawyered up quickly, and the investigation stalled. Tunnel vision, Ethan muttered, the frustration boiling up inside him. You focused on the easy targets and missed the real killer. Thorne sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It was a different time, Ethan. Forensic technology was limited. Cultural biases were prevalent. The prevailing theory was that they ran off with truckers. It was easier to believe that than to confront the possibility of something more sinister. The runaway theory had always infuriated Ethan. His mother would never have left him. She was fiercely loyal, grounded. The rumors had only deepened the family's pain, painting Martha and Clara as reckless and irresponsible. So what now? Ethan asked, his voice rising. Are you going to re-interview Foster and Corbin? Rehash the same old leads that led nowhere? Yes, Thorne confirmed. They're still the primary persons of interest. We need to apply pressure, see if their stories have changed over the past 12 years. We need to eliminate the known variables before we start exploring the unknowns. But the warehouse, Ethan argued, gesturing to the file containing the crime scene photos. That's the first real lead we've had in 12 years. My mother was found there. Shouldn't we be focusing on who owned that warehouse? Who had access to it? Thorne gave him a placating look, the kind police reserved for grieving relatives. Ethan, we have procedures. We have to be methodical. We can't afford tunnel vision this time either. We will investigate the warehouse thoroughly, but we have to follow the evidence. Procedure, Ethan repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. That's what you said 12 years ago. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. I can't just sit here and wait for you to follow procedure, Detective. I need to do something. Thorne looked up at him, his expression sympathetic but firm. I understand your frustration, Ethan. But this is a homicide investigation. You need to let us handle it. Don't go interfering in official police business. You'll only jeopardize the investigation. Ethan didn't respond. He walked out of the police station, the bright afternoon sun blinding him. He knew, with a cold certainty, that he couldn't rely on the police to find the answers he needed. They were bound by their rules, their timelines. If he wanted the truth, he would have to find it himself. Heading toward his car, his mind raced. The warehouse was the key. He needed to find out who owned it, who had access to it, and he knew exactly who to ask. Bill Thompson, the man who had lived with the guilt of that night for 12 years. It was time for him to pay his debt. Bill Thompson was exactly where Ethan expected him to be, behind the counter of his small, struggling hardware store on the outskirts of Kearney. The store smelled of fertilizer and sawdust, a cluttered maze of shelves stocked with tools, gardening supplies, and miscellaneous household items. Business was slow. It always was. Ethan pushed open the door, the bell above it jangling cheerfully. Bill looked up from the newspaper he was reading, a polite smile freezing on his face when he recognized Ethan. The years had not been kind to him. Stooped and gaunt, his face was a road map of regret. The guilt had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell of the man Ethan remembered. Ethan? Ethan Mallory? Bill's voice was hesitant, laced with apprehension. He wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes darting nervously around the empty store. "Hello, Bill." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Bill looked away, fiddling with a stack of receipts on the counter. "I heard about Martha," he said finally, his voice low. "On the news." "I'm so sorry, Ethan. Truly." "Are you?" Ethan's voice was cold, the resentment he had carried for 12 years bubbling to the surface. He walked toward the counter, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. "You left them alone that night, Bill." "You closed early." Bill flinched as if struck. I know I did. It was a slow night. I wanted to get home early. My wife was sick. I thought they'd be fine. They always were." "You were the manager," Ethan pressed, his voice rising. "It was your responsibility to make sure they were safe. To lock up with them." Finally, Bill met his gaze, his eyes filled with a profound, agonizing guilt. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't lived with that every single day for the past 12 years? He broke down then, tears streaming down his face, leaning against the counter, his shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I should have stayed. I should have walked them to their cars. It's my fault. It's all my fault." Ethan watched him, the anger slowly receding, replaced by a weary understanding. Bill Thompson wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had made a mistake with devastating consequences. He was as much a victim of that night as Ethan was, trapped in his own prison of guilt and regret. "They found her in a warehouse in Omaha," Ethan said, his voice softening slightly. "In a pickle barrel." Bill stared at him, horror-stricken. A pickle barrel? Oh, God, Martha. The grotesque details seemed to hit him hard. He buried his face in his hands, his breath coming in short gasps. Ethan waited, letting the older man process the horrific reality. When Bill finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "What can I do, Ethan?" "Anything. I'll do anything. I have to help. I owe it to Martha. I owe it to you." "I need information," Ethan said, "about the warehouse." "Do you recognize the address?" He slid the slip of paper across the counter with the location Thorne had given him. Bill studied it, squinting. He shook his head. "No, I don't recognize it. We didn't have any dealings in Omaha." "What about the suppliers?" Ethan asked, the connection forming in his mind. "Who supplied the pickles?" Bill frowned, thinking. "Midwest Provisions. They supplied everything. The meat, the produce, the dry goods. Pickles. They were our main supplier. Midwest Provisions." The name resonated with a faint familiarity. Ethan filed it away for later. "Did they have a warehouse in Omaha?" "I assume so," Bill said. "They were a big company. They had distribution centers all over the state. They were based in Omaha." Omaha, the connection solidified. "I need records," Ethan said, the urgency growing. "From the diner. Schedules, supplier invoices, employee lists. Anything from 1983? Bill looked surprised. "Records?" "I don't know, Ethan. That was a long time ago. The diner closed down a few years after they disappeared. I don't know what happened to the records." "You must have kept something," Ethan insisted, gripping the edge of the counter. You were the manager. Tax returns, business filings, anything. Bill hesitated, chewing on his lower lip. He seemed desperate for atonement, eager to alleviate the crushing weight of his guilt. I might have a box, he admitted slowly. In the back office. I cleaned out my desk when the diner closed. I kept some things. I don't know why. Maybe I thought they might be useful someday. Maybe I just couldn't let go. Get it, Ethan said, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. Nodding eagerly, Bill disappeared into the back office, a cramped space cluttered with invoices and catalogs. He returned a few minutes later, carrying a dusty cardboard box, setting it on the counter between them. The box was filled with brittle paperwork, yellowed invoices, faded schedules, handwritten notes. It smelled of mildew and time. This is it, Bill said, pulling the lid off the box. Everything I have from 1983. Ethan looked at the mountain of paperwork, a daunting task ahead of him. But he knew, with a growing certainty, that the answers he sought were buried somewhere in those boxes. The key to unlocking the truth, the connection between the diner and the warehouse, the name of the person who destroyed his life. Hours blurred together as they immersed themselves in the brittle, yellowing paperwork. The back office was small and airless, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the weak light, the air thick with the smell of aging paper and stale cigarette smoke embedded in the walls. They worked methodically, sorting through the invoices by supplier and date, the silence broken only by the rustling of paper and the occasional cough. Ethan's eyes burned with exhaustion, his back aching from hunching over the desk. Focusing on the supplier invoices, he looked for anything that might connect the diner to the Omaha warehouse. One name dominated the stack, Midwest Provisions. They really did supply everything, Ethan murmured, flipping through the invoices. Weekly deliveries. Sometimes more. They were reliable, Bill said, rubbing his tired eyes. Good prices, good service. They had a monopoly on the I-80 route. Ethan paused at an invoice dated October 1983, just weeks before the disappearance. It listed a bulk order of pickles, delivered in large wooden barrels. The same kind of barrel his mother had been found in. Midwest Provisions, Ethan said, the name feeling heavy on his tongue. They supplied the pickles. And the barrels. Yes, Bill agreed. I told you that. But if the killer worked for Midwest Provisions, Ethan reasoned, the implication hitting him, he would have access to the barrels. He would know how to seal them, and he would know the diner's routines. The theory felt solid, grounded in the reality of the evidence. But proof was still needed. They needed to connect Midwest Provisions to the warehouse where Martha was found. We need to find out if they owned that warehouse, Ethan said, his voice trembling with excitement. How? Bill asked, looking overwhelmed. It's been 12 years. They might not even be in business anymore. County records, Ethan said, a plan forming in his mind. The deeds for the warehouse will be on file at the Douglas County Courthouse in Omaha. It was a long shot, but the only lead they had. Gathering the Midwest Provisions invoices, Ethan tucked them carefully into a folder. I'm going to Omaha, he said, standing up. I'm coming with you, Bill said, his tone firm. Ethan looked at him, surprised. You don't have to do that, Bill. Yes, I do, Bill insisted. I owe it to Martha. I owe it to you. They drove to Omaha the next morning, the silence in the car companionable, a shared sense of purpose binding them together. The familiar landscape of central Nebraska blurred past the windows, the rolling hills giving way to the industrial sprawl of the city. Arriving at the Douglas County Courthouse, an imposing stone building that smelled of wax polish and bureaucracy, Ethan felt out of place. Navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the records office among the lawyers and clerks, he finally found the right counter, filling out a request form with the warehouse address. The wait lasted nearly an hour, the anticipation agonizing. Ethan paced the corridor, the marble floor echoing his footsteps. Bill sat on a wooden bench, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Finally, a clerk returned with a thick binder, dropping it heavily on the counter. "Here you go," she said dismissively. "Property records for 5400 Industrial Road." Ethan opened the binder, his hands trembling slightly. He flipped through the pages, scanning the dense legal jargon. Tracing the ownership history of the warehouse back in time, he found a long list of transfers and sales over the decades, a confusing trail of holding companies and investment firms. He traced it back to 1985, 1984, and then he saw it. 1983. The owner of the warehouse on Industrial Road was listed as Midwest Provisions, Incorporated. The breath rushed out of him. He stared at the entry, the faded ink confirming his suspicions. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random location. The warehouse where his mother was found was owned by the same company that supplied the diner. Stumbling back from the counter, his mind reeled. Bill rushed to his side, his eyes wide with shock. "What is it? What did you find?" Ethan pointed a trembling finger at the name in the binder. Midwest Provisions. They own the warehouse. They returned to the car, the realization settling heavily between them. The implications were staggering. "The killer wasn't a random trucker," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "It wasn't the correctional officers. It was someone connected to the company," Bill finished, his face pale. "Someone with access to the diner, the barrels, and the warehouse." The scope of the investigation had suddenly narrowed. The faceless killer was no longer a phantom of the highway. He was someone who knew the routine, someone who blended into the background, someone who had hidden in plain sight for 12 years. "The maintenance crews," Bill said suddenly, his eyes widening in realization. "They used to come late at night, after closing, to fix the equipment, replenish the supplies." "The pickle barrels," Ethan whispered. They were heavy. They needed specialized equipment to move them. "Exactly," Bill confirmed. "The maintenance crews had access to the delivery vans, the loading docks. They could come and go without anyone noticing." The pieces clicked into place, forming a terrifying picture. The killer wasn't a stranger. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted. "We need a list," Ethan said, his voice hardening with resolve. "A list of everyone who worked for Midwest Provisions in 1983, everyone who had access to the diner and the warehouse." But first, they needed to force the police to look at Midwest Provisions. And to do that, the distraction of the correctional officers had to be eliminated. Detective Thorne wouldn't prioritize the Midwest Provisions link until the correctional officers, Marcus Foster and Aaron Corbin, were conclusively cleared. Ethan knew this. The police were methodical, and Foster and Corbin remained the most immediate loose end from the original investigation. Ethan decided he couldn't wait for Thorne to get around to it. He had to force the issue. He and Bill started looking for the officers. Public records searches revealed that Aaron Corbin had moved out of state years ago, but Marcus Foster still worked in corrections. He was now a lieutenant at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. Tracking him down wasn't difficult. Ethan and Bill waited in the parking lot of the penitentiary, the imposing structure looming over them, barbed wire glistening in the afternoon sun. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with the weight of confinement. A knot of apprehension formed in Ethan's stomach. He was a fabrication worker, not a detective. He had no experience confronting suspects, no training in interrogation. But the urgency of the situation propelled him forward. They waited for the shift change, watching the guards file out. Ethan recognized Foster from the photos in the case file. Older now, heavier, with a shaved head and an arrogant swagger. He walked toward a pickup truck, jingling his keys. "Lieutenant Foster," Ethan called out, stepping into his path. Foster stopped, looking annoyed. "Who are you?" "My name is Ethan Mallory," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Martha Mallory's son. Foster's expression hardened. He recognized the name. I have nothing to say to you. I told the police everything I know 12 years ago. He tried to push past them, but Ethan held his ground. Bill stood slightly behind Ethan, radiating nervous energy. They found her body, Ethan said, his voice cold. This isn't a missing persons case anymore. It's a homicide investigation, and you're the prime suspect. Foster glared at him. I didn't kill anyone. Me and Corbin left that diner and went home. We didn't see anything. You were the last ones to see them alive, Ethan pressed. You expect us to believe you just drove away and they vanished into thin air? I don't care what you believe, Foster spat. Now get out of my way. We know about the warehouse, Ethan said, a calculated bluff. We know about Midwest Provisions. We know the killer is connected to them. If you know something, now is the time to say it, because if you don't, the police are going to assume you were involved. Foster hesitated. The mention of Midwest Provisions seemed to register something. His arrogance wavered, replaced by a flicker of fear. He didn't want to be dragged back into this investigation, especially now that it was a murder case. Glancing around nervously, he was aware of the attention they were attracting. Look, Foster said, lowering his voice. We didn't tell the police everything back then. We didn't want the scrutiny. Ethan waited, his heart pounding. We were slightly intoxicated, Foster admitted, looking ashamed. We'd had a few beers before we stopped at the diner. We didn't want to get in trouble, so we simplified our story. What did you leave out? Bill asked, stepping forward, his voice urgent. Foster sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. As we were pulling out of the parking lot around 11:10 p.m., we saw them, Martha and Clara. They were by the dumpsters, taking a smoke break, just like the trucker reported. Were they alone? Ethan asked, the anticipation agonizing. Foster shook his head. No, there was a van parked nearby, idling. A surge of adrenaline shot through Ethan. What kind of van? A maintenance van, Foster said, the words rushing out. White, with a logo on the side. It said, Midwest Provisions. The confirmation struck Ethan like a physical blow. A Midwest Provisions van at the scene of the disappearance at the exact time they vanished. Why didn't you report this? Ethan demanded, incredulous, the anger rising in him. Because it seemed innocuous at the time, Foster insisted. It was a supplier van. We assumed they were making a late delivery or doing maintenance. It didn't seem important. And like I said, we didn't want the police looking too closely at us. We thought they ran away. Everyone thought they ran away. Innocuous. The word chilled Ethan. The killer had used the mundane, the ordinary, to conceal his horrific crime. Ethan stared at him, realizing the profound impact of this omission. 12 years wasted because these men didn't want to admit they were drinking. 12 years of rumors, of pain, of uncertainty. You need to tell the police, Ethan said, his voice cold with rage. I will, Foster agreed quickly, eager to clear his name now that the truth was coming out. I'll call that Detective Thorne guy right now. Ethan and Bill walked away, leaving Foster standing by his truck, his face pale and shaken. They had the confirmation they needed. The killer was linked to Midwest Provisions, and now the police would have to listen. The investigation had shifted. The focus narrowed. The enemy was coming into view. The revelation of the maintenance van shifted the entire focus of the investigation. It confirmed Ethan's theory. The killer was an employee, someone with legitimate access to the diner and the warehouse. Maintenance crews, Bill explained as they drove away from the penitentiary, his voice animated with a mixture of excitement and fear. They often worked after hours. Repairs, specialized replenishments. The heavy pickle barrels, for instance. They were heavy, awkward. The regular delivery drivers wouldn't handle them. The maintenance crews would bring them in after hours when the diner was closed or slow. It would make sense for them to be there late at night. This explained how the killer could have abducted the women and transported the body without attracting attention. He was part of the background noise, a familiar presence that no one questioned. Ethan immediately called Detective Thorne. He relayed the information about the van, emphasizing that Marcus Foster was on his way to give a formal statement. Thorne recognized the significance of the development. The tunnel vision on the correctional officers had finally broken. "This changes everything, Ethan. We now have a direct link between the crime scene and the company that owns the warehouse where your mother was found." "We need the employee records from Midwest Provisions," Ethan insisted. "We need to know who was driving that van that night. The maintenance crew list from 1983. "I agree," Thorne said. "But getting a warrant for 12-year-old personnel records takes time. We have to build the case, establish probable cause. Foster's statement will help, but it might not be enough on its own. We have to do this by the book. If we rush, we risk compromising the investigation." Ethan felt the familiar frustration rising again. Time was wasting. If the killer was still out there, still connected to the company, they needed to move fast. "We can't wait for a warrant," Ethan said, his voice rising. "We have to get those records ourselves." "It's not that simple," Thorne cautioned. "They're a large corporation. They're not just going to hand over confidential employee information without a legal fight. I told you not to interfere, Ethan. Let us handle this." Ignoring the warning, Ethan knew he couldn't wait for warrants and subpoenas. He had to get the records himself. He and Bill drove to the Midwest Provisions head office in Omaha. It was a large, imposing building, all glass and steel, a stark contrast to the dusty diner and the dilapidated warehouse. The sheer scale of the operation was intimidating. They walked into the reception area, the air conditioning a welcome relief from the summer heat. They asked to speak to someone in Human Resources, explaining that they were investigating a cold case related to a former employee. They were met with polite but firm resistance. The HR manager, a woman with a strained smile and an air of corporate efficiency named Mrs. Albright, explained that the company policy prohibited the release of personnel records without a warrant. "We understand," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But this is a homicide investigation. We have reason to believe one of your former employees was involved in the murder of my mother." Mrs. Albright's smile faltered, but her resolve remained firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mallory, but I cannot help you. The records from 1983 have been archived. Accessing them would require significant resources, and we cannot do so without a legal obligation. We have procedures we must follow. We will cooperate with the police if they provide a warrant." "Archived," Ethan repeated, the words sounding like a death knell. They were stonewalled, the corporate machinery grinding against their desperate search for the truth. Leaving the building defeated, the frustration gnawed at them. They were so close, yet the crucial information remained just out of reach. "What now?" Bill asked, his voice heavy with despair. Leaning against the car, Ethan racked his brain for an alternative. He looked at the sprawling complex, the trucks coming and going, the employees moving with purpose. Midwest Provisions was a machine, efficient and impersonal, but machines were run by people, and people had memories. "There has to be another way," Ethan muttered. Bill paused, thinking. "There might be another way, but it's a long shot." "What?" Ethan asked, turning to him. "The former HR manager," Bill said, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Mr. Abernathy, he retired a few years ago. He was the HR manager for decades. He knew everything about the company, everyone who worked here." "Do you know where he lives?" Ethan asked, the urgency returning. "I think so," Bill said. "He used to live in a neighborhood near the old diner. He was old school, believed in the sanctity of paper. He distrusted the company's move to digital records, said they were too easily manipulated." "You think he kept copies?" Ethan asked, his heart leaping. "It's possible," Bill said, grabbing his coat. It was a long shot, but the only option they had left. They drove back to Kearney, the hope rekindled, the search narrowed down to one man. A man who held the key to the past, the key to unlocking the secrets of Midwest provisions. They found Mr. Abernathy's house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. A modest ranch-style home, well-maintained, the lawn neatly mowed. It was a stark contrast to the industrial sprawl of Midwest provisions. Ethan's nerves were stretched thin. This felt like their last chance. If Abernathy couldn't help them, they were back to waiting for the police, waiting for a warrant that might never come. Bill approached the door, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with anxiety. He rang the doorbell, the chime echoing softly inside the house. A moment later, the door opened. A man in his late 60s stood in the doorway, his expression curious. Frail, with thinning white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, he peered at them suspiciously through thick spectacles. "Mr. Abernathy?" Bill asked, his voice hesitant. "Yes?" "My name is Bill Thompson. I used to manage the I-80 truck stop diner. We used to work together, back in the 80s. Abernathy's eyes widened in recognition. "Bill Thompson? Of course. It's been a long time." He smiled warmly, the suspicion melting away. "It has," Bill agreed, a flicker of relief passing over his face. "I'm sorry to bother you at home, but we need your help." Abernathy's expression turned serious. "What is it?" "Come in, come in." He invited them inside, the house smelling of old books and lemon polish. They sat in the living room, surrounded by towering bookshelves and framed photographs. Bill explained the situation, his voice low and urgent. Martha's discovery, the connection to Midwest provisions, the obstruction by the current management. He appealed to Abernathy's sense of justice, his dedication to the company he had served for so long. Abernathy listened intently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Having dedicated his life to the company, the thought that it might be harboring a murderer disturbed him deeply. "They're stonewalling you," Abernathy murmured, shaking his head. "Typical." They always prioritized the company's reputation over the well-being of its employees. Ever since they moved to digital records, they've lost touch with the human element. "We need the personnel records from 1983, Ethan interjected, stepping forward. "The maintenance roster. The vehicle logs. We believe the killer was one of your employees. I'm Martha's son, Ethan." Abernathy looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I can't imagine what you've been through." He paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I always distrusted the digital records," he admitted. "They felt impersonal, ephemeral, so I kept physical copies." Ethan's heart leaped. "You have the records?" "I have copies of everything," Abernathy confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. "Schedules, rosters, logs. I kept them organized year by year. It felt like a responsibility, a duty to the people who dedicated their lives to the company." He looked at Ethan, his eyes blazing with a sudden intensity. "If one of our own was involved in this horrific crime," he said, his voice hardening, "then I have a duty to help you find him." He led them through the house to the garage. It was immaculate, organized, a stark contrast to Bill's cluttered space. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer neatly labeled. 1983, Abernathy muttered, scanning the labels. "Here it is." He opened a drawer, the metal scraping softly. Inside, the files were pristine, preserved, a testament to Abernathy's meticulous care. Pulling out a thick folder labeled Maintenance Department 1983, he handed it to Ethan, the weight of the information heavy in his hands. Ethan opened the folder, his fingers trembling. Inside, the maintenance roster, the names typed neatly on the page. The vehicle logs, the entries handwritten, detailing the movements of the maintenance vans. The realization hit him. The answers were here, in this folder. The name of the killer, the man who had haunted his life for 12 years, was hidden in these pages. The search was finally narrowing. The abstract threat was about to take a human form. Spreading the files out on Abernathy's workbench, the fluorescent light illuminated the faded ink. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Dozens of names, hundreds of entries. Ethan and Bill hunched over the pages, their eyes scanning the lists of names, the dates, the vehicle numbers. The maintenance roster listed 20 names, 20 potential suspects. The task of narrowing it down seemed daunting. "We need to focus on the night of the disappearance," Ethan said, pulling out the vehicle logs for October 1983. October 15th. They scanned the entries for that night. Most of the maintenance crews clocked out at 5 p.m., but a few were listed as on call, responsible for emergency repairs and after-hours maintenance. "The I-80 route," Bill pointed out. That's where the diner was located. They cross-referenced the on-call list with the I-80 route assignments. 3 names emerged, 3 men who had access to the maintenance vans that night who were assigned to the area where the diner was located. Robert Johnson, Michael Smith, Leon Dobbins. Ethan read the names aloud, his voice tense. "Robert Johnson," Bill muttered, his brow furrowed. "I remember him. Older guy, close to retirement. He wouldn't hurt a fly." "Michael Smith," Ethan continued. "He quit shortly after the disappearance," Bill recalled. "Moved to Arizona. I think he had family there." "Leon Dobbins," Ethan said, the name unfamiliar. Bill stared at the name, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Leon Dobbins," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I remember him." "Who was he?" Ethan pressed, his heart pounding. "He was a regular," Bill said, the memory surfacing reluctantly. "Quiet guy, kept to himself, came in late for coffee and pie, blended into the background. A regular." The word chilled Ethan. The killer wasn't a stranger. He was a familiar face. "He was a maintenance worker?" Ethan asked. "Yes," Bill confirmed, "but he was also a warehouse foreman and maintenance supervisor." Warehouse foreman. The title resonated with a sickening familiarity. He had access to the warehouse, the barrels, the keys to the diner, the perfect combination of access and opportunity. "What else do you remember about him?" Ethan asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Bill hesitated, a troubled expression crossing his face. He was obsessed with Clara. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. A motive, a clear, compelling motive. "He used to stare at her," Bill continued, the details spilling out. "Made her uncomfortable. He tried to ask her out a few times. She always turned him down. He wouldn't take the hint." "And my mother?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Martha was protective of Clara," Bill said, his eyes filling with tears. "She intervened a few times, told Dobbins to leave her alone. She was wary of him. She said there was something off about him." Wary. The word echoed in Ethan's mind. His mother had sensed the danger. She had tried to protect Clara. A clear motive and opportunity emerged, forming a terrifying picture. Dobbins, fueled by obsession and rejection, lashing out in a violent rage. "He had access to the warehouse," Ethan murmured, his mind racing. "He knew the layout, the security protocols. He could hide the body there without anyone noticing." "And the pickle barrel," Bill added, his voice grim. "He handled the inventory. He knew how to seal it, how to make it disappear." The pieces clicked into place, the puzzle complete. Leon Dobbins. The name resonated with a chilling finality. A wave of nausea washed over Ethan. The killer wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a quiet man who drank coffee and ate pie, a man they had known, trusted. He looked at Bill, his eyes burning with a cold fury. "We found him." The investigation had reached a turning point. The enemy had a name, a face, and Ethan was going to make him pay. Armed with the name, Ethan shifted his focus to the present. Leon Dobbins. Where was he now? Had he disappeared, vanished into the anonymous expanse of the country, swallowed by the silence? Or was he still here, hiding in plain sight, living a seemingly normal life, the blood on his hands washed clean by time and indifference? Ethan returned to the county courthouse, his movements driven by a restless energy, a burning need to know. Checking public records, property deeds, vehicle registrations, he needed to find an address, a location, a place to confront the shadow that had haunted his life. He found it quickly enough. Dobbins still lived in the area, in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Omaha. A neighborhood filled with manicured lawns and picket fences, a facade of suburban normalcy. He had lived a seemingly normal life for the past 12 years. Married, divorced, no children, employed at a local manufacturing plant, a cog in the machine, a ghost in the system. Ethan started driving by the neighborhood, cruising slowly down the street, his eyes scanning the houses. The realization of the killer's proximity chilled him to the bone. A strange mixture of anticipation and dread filled him, the hunter closing in on his prey. He saw him on the third pass. Dobbins was mowing his lawn, a mundane domestic scene that contrasted sharply with the monstrous reality of his crimes. The banality of the act emphasized the horror of his secret. He was older, heavier, his hair thinning, but recognizable from Bill's description. A quiet man, blending into the background, invisible. Parking his car down the street, Ethan watched Dobbins from a distance, the silence in the car heavy with the weight of his discovery. A surge of rage rose in his throat, a primal urge to confront him, to make him confess, to force him to acknowledge the pain he had inflicted. But he knew he couldn't. He had to be smart, methodical. Building a case required following the rules, even when the rules protected the guilty. He presented the name and the supporting evidence to Detective Thorne. The maintenance roster, the vehicle logs, Bill's testimony. The motive, the opportunity, the access. The case against Dobbins was compelling, undeniable. Thorne listened intently, his expression grim, the realization of the truth sinking in. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was strong, persuasive. "We're putting him under surveillance," Thorne confirmed, his voice low, the determination evident in his tone. "We'll track his movements, monitor his communications. We need to catch him in the act. We need to find the proof." "In the act of what?" Ethan demanded, his frustration mounting, the impatience gnawing at him. "He already committed the murder, 12 years ago. What are you waiting for?" "We need concrete evidence linking him to the crime," Thorne explained patiently, the bureaucratic constraints holding him back. "The evidence we have is circumstantial. It's not enough for an arrest warrant, not enough for a conviction." "Circumstantial?" Ethan retorted, incredulous, the injustice of it staggering. "We have a motive, a witness, a connection to the crime scene. We have everything but a smoking gun." "It's not enough," Thorne insisted, his voice firm, the adherence to the rules unwavering. "We need physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, a confession. We need something tangible, something undeniable." "You won't get a confession from him," Ethan argued, the desperation fueling his defiance. "He's too smart, too careful. He's been hiding for 12 years. He won't crack." "Then we'll wait," Thorne said, his tone firm, the patience of a seasoned investigator evident in his demeanor. "We'll watch him until he makes a mistake. They always do. The guilt, the pressure, the fear. It always catches up with them." Ethan stared at the detective, the realization dawning on him, the gulf between them widening. Thorne was still bound by the system, the procedures, the rules. He wouldn't bend the law, even to catch a murderer. He was a good cop, but a prisoner of the system. If Ethan wanted justice, he would have to step outside the law. He would have to force Dobbins' hand. He would have to take the risk. Leaving the police station, his mind raced, a plan forming. He knew what he had to do. Confront the shadow in plain sight. Bring the darkness into the light. The confrontation was inevitable. The interrogation room was small and airless, the beige walls closing in, the atmosphere thick with tension. Detective Thorne sat across the table from Leon Dobbins. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Thorne watched the man, analyzing his body language, his demeanor, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack in the facade. Dobbins appeared calm, composed, unsettlingly bland. He looked like any other middle-aged man, his face unremarkable, his eyes devoid of emotion, a blank slate reflecting the world around him. He had agreed to come in for questioning voluntarily. His demeanor was cooperative, almost accommodating, as if he had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. "Mr. Dobbins," Thorne began, his voice measured, professional, the tone of a seasoned investigator conducting a routine interview. "We're investigating the disappearance of Martha Mallory and Clara Shaw in 1983. You worked for Midwest Provisions at the time, correct?" Dobbins nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Yes, that's correct. I was the warehouse foreman and maintenance supervisor. A long time ago." "And you frequented the I-80 diner where they worked?" Thorne continued, his gaze fixed on Dobbins, searching for any flicker of recognition, any hint of guilt. "Occasionally," Dobbins replied, shrugging, the gesture casual, dismissive. "Coffee and pie. It was on my route, a good place to stop, refuel." "You knew the Waitresses?" Thorne pressed, the question hanging in the air between them. "I knew of them," Dobbins corrected, his tone precise, the distinction subtle but significant. "They were friendly, efficient, good workers, a loss to the community." "You were particularly fond of Clara Shaw, weren't you?" Thorne pressed, leaning closer, the intimacy of the question designed to unsettle, to provoke a reaction. Dobbins chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, the amusement reaching his eyes. "She was a pretty girl. Hard not to notice. A ray of sunshine in a dreary world." "You asked her out a few times, didn't you?" Thorne continued, the accusation masked as a question. "Maybe once or twice," Dobbins conceded, waving a dismissive hand, the gesture minimizing the significance of his actions. "Harmless flirting. She wasn't interested. I respected that." "It bothered you, didn't it?" Thorne insisted, his voice hardening, the pressure mounting. "The rejection. The humiliation?" "Not at all," Dobbins replied smoothly, the denial automatic, rehearsed. "There are plenty of other fish in the sea." I moved on. Thorne shifted tactics. He laid out the evidence, the circumstantial links connecting Dobbins to the crime, the web of coincidence and opportunity tightening around him. The maintenance van, the access to the warehouse, the pickle barrel. Dobbins listened patiently, his expression impassive, his demeanor untroubled. He denied everything, his denials calm, rational, plausible, a fortress of lies built on a foundation of truth. "I might have driven past the diner that night," he admitted, shrugging, the concession meaningless, unverifiable. "I don't remember. It was 12 years ago. The memory fades." "Witnesses saw your van idling near the dumpsters," Thorne countered, his voice sharp, the accusation clear. "Around the time they disappeared." "Witnesses can be mistaken," Dobbins replied, smiling faintly, the confidence bordering on arrogance. "And even if I was there, it doesn't mean I had anything to do with their disappearance. Correlation is not causation, Detective." "Where were you that night?" Thorne demanded, the frustration boiling over, the mask of professionalism slipping. "Working," Dobbins said instantly, the answer ready, the alibi prepared. "Inventory at the warehouse." "Alone?" An airtight alibi. No witnesses, no corroboration, no way to disprove it. Thorne pushed harder, probing for cracks in Dobbins' facade, looking for any sign of guilt or remorse, any flicker of humanity beneath the surface. But there was nothing. Dobbins was a void, a blank slate, a mirror reflecting the darkness of the world around him. The interrogation lasted for hours, a grueling battle of wits and wills, a psychological chess game played with words and silence. But without concrete evidence, Thorne couldn't hold him. He was forced to release him, the defeat tasting like ash in his mouth. Dobbins stood up, smoothing his jacket, his demeanor still calm, composed, the victory evident in his eyes. "Is that all, detective?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness, the arrogance chilling. Thorne stared at him, a cold chill running down his spine, the realization of the man's monstrosity hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He knew with absolute certainty that he was looking at a murderer, but knowing wasn't enough. "For now," Thorne said, his voice tight, the promise of a future confrontation hanging in the air. Dobbins smiled, a chillingly empty expression, a mask hiding the darkness within. "Have a nice day, detective. I'll be seeing you." He walked out of the interrogation room, a free man, the silence closing in behind him. He was now aware that he was the primary suspect, and Thorne knew, with growing dread, that the danger had just escalated exponentially. The game was no longer about investigation. It was about survival. Enraged by the news that Dobbins had been released, Ethan confronted Thorne, his frustration boiling over. "You let him go?" he demanded, pacing the cramped office. "After everything we found?" "How could you let him go?" "We had no choice, Ethan," Thorne said, his voice weary. "The evidence is still circumstantial. We can't hold him without proof. We don't have enough evidence to hold him." "Proof?" Ethan exploded. He admitted he was obsessed with Clara. He admitted he was at the warehouse that night. "It's not enough," Thorne insisted. "He has an alibi, however flimsy, and he didn't crack under pressure." "He knows," Ethan retorted, his voice trembling with rage. "He knows we're on to him. He's going to run." "We have him under surveillance," Thorne assured him. "He won't get far. We just have to wait for him to make a mistake." "Wait?" The word felt like a death sentence. Ethan couldn't wait. He felt the investigation slipping away, the momentum lost. Returning to his apartment in Kearney, the exhaustion settled deep in his bones. He felt defeated, helpless. The hope that had driven him forward was fading, replaced by a growing despair. He tried to sleep, but the images of the pickle barrel, of Dobbins' bland, unremarkable face, haunted him. Tossing and turning, the silence of the apartment amplified his anxiety. A few nights later, Ethan returned to his apartment after a late shift at the fabrication shop. The physical labor had helped to clear his mind, but the underlying fear remained. He walked up the stairs to his apartment, the familiar creak of the wooden steps echoing in the quiet hallway. Reaching his front door, he fumbled with his keys. He inserted the key into the lock, but it didn't turn. The door was already unlocked. A chill crawled up his spine. He always locked his door. Always. Pushing the door open slowly, the hinges squeaked softly. The apartment was dark, silent. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for the light switch, the sudden brightness illuminating the small living room. Everything looked normal. The furniture, the books, the dirty dishes in the sink. Nothing seemed out of place. Moving cautiously through the apartment, he checked the windows, the doors. The lock on the front door had been picked. Faint scratches around the keyhole were the only sign of forced entry. He began to relax, the tension easing slightly. Maybe he was just being paranoid. He walked into the bedroom, tossing his keys on the dresser. And then he saw it. On his bedside table, the framed photo of Martha and Clara, the last photo taken of them, smiling brightly in their turquoise uniforms. It was turned face down. A wave of nausea washed over him. He stared at the overturned photograph, the implication clear. It wasn't a burglary. It was a threat, a message, a silent assertion of power. Dobbins had been inside his home. He had touched his belongings, violated his sanctuary. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into a paralyzing terror. He felt exposed, vulnerable. It was then Ethan realized that Dobbins wasn't just smart and controlled. He was dangerous, willing to do anything to protect his secret. But the fear didn't paralyze him. It galvanized him. It transformed his grief and rage into a cold, hard resolve. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't let Dobbins intimidate him, silence him. He had to push forward no matter the risk. The escalation had begun. The game had changed, and Ethan was ready to play. The violation of his home changed everything. The abstract threat had become personal, immediate. Ethan knew he was no longer safe. Dobbins was watching him, testing him, trying to intimidate him into silence. But the fear also sharpened his focus. He became convinced that proving what happened to Clara was the key. His mother was dead. The discovery of her body had reopened the case. But Clara was still missing. If Dobbins was obsessed with her, he wouldn't have killed her immediately. He would have wanted to possess her, to control her. He must have taken her somewhere secluded, somewhere hidden. Ethan shifted his focus from the past to the present. Finding where Dobbins would have taken her became the priority. He returned to the county courthouse in Omaha, the familiar scent of aging paper and floor wax filling his nostrils. He dug deeper into the property records associated with Dobbins and his known relatives. He was looking for anything acquired around 1983, anything that suggested a hidden location. Hours were spent immersed in the records, the microfilm reader blurring his vision. He traced the ownership history of Dobbins' house, his vehicles, his known assets. Nothing stood out. Expanding the search, he looked at inheritance records, probate files. And then he found it, an inheritance record from 1983. Dobbins had inherited a property from an uncle, a remote, isolated farm located deep in the rural countryside. The inheritance was finalized just weeks before the disappearance. The timing was chilling. Dobbins had acquired the perfect hiding place just before he committed the perfect crime. Ethan scribbled down the address, his hand trembling with anticipation. The farm was located in a sparsely populated area, miles from the nearest town, a place where no one would hear a scream, where no one would notice a disturbance. Driving out to the location the next day, the landscape blurred past the window in a wash of green and brown. The paved road turned to gravel, then to dirt. The isolation was palpable, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the trees. He found the property, a dilapidated farmhouse surrounded by overgrown fields. The house was boarded up, the windows shattered, the paint peeling. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Ethan parked his car far away, hidden behind a cluster of trees. Cautiously, he approached the farmhouse, his heart pounding in his chest. Circling the property, he looked for any sign of recent activity. The overgrown grass, the rusted barbed wire fence, the decaying barn, everything suggested neglect, abandonment. But then he saw it. Relatively fresh tire tracks on the dirt path leading to the farmhouse. Someone had been here recently. Moving closer to the house, his senses heightened, his nerves on edge, he checked the doors, the windows. All secured, boarded up. He noticed a heavy-duty new padlock on the old wooden storm cellar doors at the side of the house. The padlock stood out starkly against the decay, the shiny metal contrasting with the weathered wood. Why would someone put a new padlock on an abandoned storm cellar? A cold chill ran down his spine. The instinctual realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was the place. This was where Dobbins had taken Clara. This was where she had suffered, where she might still be hidden. He had found the hidden property. The prison where Clara Shaw might have spent the last 12 years. Ethan spent the rest of the day observing the farm from a distance. Hidden among the trees, the binoculars he had borrowed from Bill were pressed against his eyes. He watched the farmhouse, the cellar doors, the surrounding fields. The silence was unsettling. the isolation profound. The only signs of life were the birds circling overhead and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. He mapped the area in his mind, noting the entry and exit points, the sight lines, the potential hiding spots. A break-in was being planned, a desperate gamble to find the proof he needed. Waiting for the police was not an option. Thorne would demand probable cause, a warrant. By the time he got it, Dobbins would have destroyed any remaining evidence. Dobbins was paranoid. The intimidation attempt proved that he was feeling the pressure. He wouldn't hesitate to cover his tracks. This had to be done by Ethan himself. As dusk settled over the landscape, casting long shadows across the fields, Ethan made his decision. He would return that night, under the cover of darkness. Driving back to town, his mind raced. He needed supplies. He returned to the hardware store, the familiar scent of dust and fertilizer filling his nostrils. Bill was behind the counter, his face etched with worry. "Where have you been?" Bill demanded, his voice urgent. "I've been trying to reach you." "I found it," Ethan said, his voice low. "The farm. It's isolated, abandoned, but someone has been there recently." He told Bill about the tire tracks, the new padlock on the cellar door. Bill paled, the implications sinking in. "You think he took her there? You think she might still be there?" "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice trembling slightly. "But I have to find out." "What are you going to do?" Bill asked, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm going back tonight," Ethan said, grabbing a heavy flashlight and a crowbar from the shelves. "I'm going to break in." "Ethan, no," Bill pleaded, grabbing his arm. "It's too dangerous. What if he's there? What if he catches you?" "I have to take that risk," Ethan retorted, pulling away. "I can't wait for the police. I have to do this, for Clara." He looked at Bill, his eyes burning with intensity. "I need you to do something for me." "Anything," Bill whispered. "If I don't return by dawn," Ethan said, his voice firm, "call Detective Thorne. Tell him where I am. Tell him about the farm." Bill nodded, his face grim. "Be careful, Ethan. Please." Ethan walked out of the store, the weight of the crowbar heavy in his hand. He was terrified, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. But the fear was overshadowed by a burning need for justice, a desperate desire for the truth. He drove back to the farm, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The isolation was absolute, the silence deafening. Alone, he was facing the darkness that had consumed his life for 12 years. He was ready to confront the monster hiding in the shadows. The farmhouse loomed before him, a skeletal silhouette against the moonlit sky. The wind whistled through the shattered windows, a mournful sound that echoed the ghosts of the past. Ethan parked his car in the same hidden spot, the silence pressing in on him. He pulled on a pair of gloves, the leather creaking in the stillness. In one hand, he gripped the flashlight, the crowbar in the other. He approached the farmhouse cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. Reaching the cellar doors, he saw the new padlock gleaming in the moonlight. He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. This was it, the point of no return. Wedging the crowbar under the hasp, he pried at the wood. The old wood splintered, groaning under the pressure. He pulled harder, the muscles in his arms screaming in protest. The hasp ripped free from the door, the screws tearing through the rotten wood. The sound echoed in the silence, a jarring intrusion on the quiet night. Ethan froze, listening, his heart pounding. Silence. He lifted the cellar doors, the heavy wood resisting his efforts. They swung open with a screech of rusted hinges, revealing a dark, gaping maw. A rush of cold, damp air hit him, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Shining the flashlight into the darkness, the beam cut through the gloom. Stone steps descended into the cellar, disappearing into the shadows. He hesitated, the fear paralyzing him for a moment. He was about to enter the prison where Clara might have been held, the place where she might have died. He thought of his mother, her vibrant smile, her infectious laugh. He thought of Clara, her youthful optimism, her unrealized dreams. Taking a deep breath, steeling his nerves, he descended the steps, the darkness swallowing him whole. The cellar was small and cramped, the ceiling low, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The flashlight beam swept across the space, illuminating the stone walls, the dirt floor, the cobwebs hanging from the rafters. It was immediately clear that someone had been held here. A makeshift cot sat in the corner, a stained mattress resting on wooden pallets. Rusted bolts protruded from the stone walls, the remnants of chains hanging from them. Crude attempts at soundproofing were evident, old foam padding stapled to the walls. It was a prison, a dungeon. A wave of nausea rose in Ethan's throat. The horror of what had happened here was palpable, tangible. He could almost feel Clara's presence, her fear, her despair. He moved further into the cellar, his movements slow, deliberate. He was searching for proof, for anything that confirmed Clara's presence. He saw faint scratches on the stone wall near the cot, tally marks. Days, weeks, months. Clara had been alive. She had survived the initial abduction. She had been held captive here, enduring unimaginable suffering. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The hope that she might still be alive evaporated, replaced by an agonizing certainty. He had to find her. He had to bring her home. Ethan's flashlight beam danced across the tally marks, each scratch a testament to Clara's desperate fight for survival. He counted them, his throat tight with emotion. Months. She had been here for months. The realization shattered the narrative he had constructed in his mind. He had assumed she was killed that night, along with his mother. But the reality was far worse. She had suffered a prolonged agony, a slow descent into darkness. Turning away from the wall, his eyes burned with unshed tears. He continued his search, his movements frantic, desperate. He needed something tangible, something undeniable, proof that Clara had been here. He examined the cot, the stained mattress, the threadbare blanket. He sifted through the debris on the dirt floor, the dust clinging to his gloves. He noticed a loose stone in the foundation wall near the cot. The mortar around it was cracked, crumbling. It was slightly askew, as if it had been removed and replaced multiple times. Pulling at the stone, his fingers scraped against the rough surface. It came loose easily, revealing a small, dark cavity behind it. He shone the flashlight into the opening, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he saw a small bundle, wrapped in cloth. He reached in and pulled it out, the cloth disintegrating in his hands. It was soft, delicate, a stark contrast to the harsh environment of the cellar. Unwrapping the bundle, the contents spilled onto the dirt floor. A layered gold necklace, a single large gold hoop earring. He recognized them instantly. They were identical to those Clara wore in the last photo, the photo he carried in his wallet, the image seared into his memory. He picked up the necklace, the delicate chain cold against his skin. Holding the earring in the palm of his hand, the metal gleamed in the flashlight beam. This was it, the proof he needed, the undeniable confirmation that Clara had been here. The relief was overwhelming, paralyzing. He sank to his knees, the tears streaming down his face. He had found her. He had brought her story into the light. Clutching the jewelry in his hand, the metal digging into his palm, he knew he had to get out of here. He had to get this evidence to Thorne. He stood up, his legs trembling. He turned towards the stairs, the exit, the light. And then he heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the cellar entrance from outside, the beams cutting through the darkness. A car engine cut out. Silence. Ethan froze, his blood running cold. Dobbins. He had returned. Paranoid after the interrogation, the intimidation attempt, he had come back to check his hiding place, to ensure his secrets remained buried. Ethan was trapped. Ethan killed his flashlight, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. Scrambling for cover, his heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He heard footsteps approaching the cellar doors. Heavy, deliberate steps. Dobbins. The footsteps stopped at the entrance. A moment of hesitation. Dobbins had noticed the broken lock, the open doors. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the cellar. Dobbins was descending the steps. Ethan pressed himself against the cold stone wall, hidden behind the old, rusted furnace. He tried to control his breathing, to silence the pounding of his heart. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay and something else, the faint scent of Dobbins' cheap cologne. Dobbins reached the bottom of the stairs. He paused, listening. He knew someone was there. The flashlight beam swept across the cellar again, closer this time. Ethan could see Dobbins' silhouette, a large, imposing figure against the backdrop of the light. The beam illuminated the cot, the tally marks on the wall, the disturbed dirt floor where Ethan had found the jewelry. Dobbins cursed, a low, guttural sound. He knew his secrets had been uncovered. He moved toward the loose stone in the wall, the cavity where the jewelry had been hidden. Reaching inside, his fingers searched the empty space. He roared in anger, the sound echoing in the cramped cellar. He turned, the flashlight beam swinging wildly, searching for the intruder. Ethan knew he couldn't hide forever. He had to make a move. Gripping the crowbar in his hand, the metal cold and heavy, he waited for the right moment. Dobbins moved closer to the furnace, the flashlight beam illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Ethan lunged, swinging the crowbar with all his strength. Dobbins reacted instantly, raising his arm to block the blow. The crowbar connected with his forearm, the impact echoing in the silence. Dobbins grunted in pain, stumbling back. Ethan didn't hesitate. He charged, tackling Dobbins around the waist. They crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of both of them. The flashlight flew out of Dobbins' hand, spinning across the dirt floor, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The struggle was brutal, desperate. They grappled in the darkness, a primal fight for survival. Dobbins was stronger, his grip like iron, his movements fueled by a cold, calculated rage. Ethan fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his adrenaline surging, his grief transformed into a burning fury. They stumbled across the cellar, crashing into the walls, the furniture. Dobbins wrapped his hands around Ethan's throat, squeezing, suffocating. Ethan gasped for air, his vision blurring, the darkness closing in. He had to break free. He had to survive. He slammed his knee into Dobbins' groin, the blow connecting with a sickening thud. Dobbins roared in pain, his grip loosening. Ethan broke free, stumbling backwards, gasping for air. Dobbins recovered quickly, his eyes burning with hatred. He lunged again, his movements relentless, unstoppable. The cat-and-mouse game was over. The fight had begun. The struggle continued, a brutal, desperate dance in the cramped space. They fought with primal desperation, their movements clumsy, chaotic, illuminated only by the flickering beam of the fallen flashlight. Ethan slammed Dobbins against a rickety wooden shelving unit, the impact rattling the flimsy structure. The unit collapsed, the shelves crashing to the floor, the contents scattering across the dirt. Jars shattered, tools clattered against the stone. The impact caused the dirt wall behind the unit to crumble slightly, the soil cascading down in a shower of dust and debris. In the disturbed earth, Ethan saw something. A flash of color, a hint of plastic. He stared at the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The unmistakable sight of something wrapped in old plastic sheeting, buried in the wall. The horrific realization hit him. He wasn't just in Clara's prison. He was in her grave. The breath rushed out of him. He stared at the plastic sheeting, the realization paralyzing him. Dobbins saw it too. He froze, his eyes fixed on the disturbed earth. A flicker of desperation crossed his face. The fight escalated with renewed fury. Dobbins realized he had nothing left to lose. He fought with a cold, calculated brutality, his movements precise and deadly. Ethan grabbed a rusted shovel lying on the floor, the metal cold and heavy in his hands. He swung wildly, the shovel connecting with Dobbins' shoulder. The sound of metal striking bone echoed in the silence. Dobbins roared in pain, stumbling backwards. He lunged again, his movement slower, weaker. Ethan swung the shovel again, the blow connecting with Dobbins' head. Dobbins staggered backward, his eyes rolling back in his head. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious, his body limp, lifeless. Ethan stood over him, the shovel trembling in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Covered in sweat and dirt, his body ached, his mind reeled. He had done it. He had survived. He looked at the collapsed wall, the disturbed earth, the plastic sheeting. He knew with agonizing certainty that Clara was there. He had found her. The silence of the cellar was broken by a new sound, distant, faint, but growing louder. Sirens. Bill, worried, had called Thorne early. Help was on the way. Stumbling towards the stairs, the adrenaline receded, the exhaustion overwhelming him. He climbed the steps, emerging into the cold night air. The flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the landscape, casting an eerie glow on the dilapidated farmhouse. He had survived the darkness. He had brought the truth into the light. But the victory was hollow, tainted by the horrific reality of Clara's fate. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain forever. The farm was transformed into a crime scene. Police cars surrounded the farmhouse, the flashing lights painting the landscape in shades of red and blue. The quiet isolation of the countryside was shattered by the organized chaos of the investigation. Detective Thorne arrived, his face grim, his movements brisk and efficient. Ethan sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over his shoulders, the paramedics checking his vitals. Bruised and exhausted, his body ached, his mind numb. The events of the night felt surreal, a waking nightmare. He watched as they carried Dobbins out of the cellar on a stretcher. Semi-conscious, his head bandaged, his face pale and slack. He was arrested, handcuffed to the stretcher, his reign of terror finally over. Ethan felt a strange sense of detachment watching him, the monster who had haunted his life reduced to a broken, defeated man. Ethan gave his statement to Thorne, his voice trembling, his words disjointed. He recounted the discovery of the farm, the break-in, the struggle in the cellar. He handed Thorne the jewelry, the necklace and earring still clutched in his hand. Pointing numbly to the cellar, the collapsed wall, the disturbed earth, he spoke. "She's there," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "Clara." "She's buried in the wall." Thorne nodded, his expression somber. He signaled to the forensic teams, the grim work of excavation about to begin. Ethan watched as they descended into the cellar, their movements slow, methodical. They worked through the night, the silence broken only by the scraping of shovels and the murmur of voices. The floodlights cast a harsh glare on the scene, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of the discovery. They confirmed the remains belonged to Clara Shaw. The news hit Ethan with a final devastating blow. The faint hope that she might still be alive, the desperate fantasy that he might have saved her, evaporated into the cold night air. The reality was far worse than he had imagined. He returned home, the sun rising over the horizon, casting a pale light on the landscape. The apartment felt empty, cold, the silence amplifying his grief. He had found the truth, but the reality was devastating. Clara had suffered for months after his mother's death, enduring unimaginable horrors in the darkness of the cellar. The victory was hollow, the justice bittersweet. He had avenged their deaths, but he couldn't bring them back. He sat in the silence, the weight of the past 12 years pressing down on him. The ghosts of Martha and Clara haunted the room, their presence palpable, tangible. He had fulfilled his promise. He had found the truth. But the cost was devastating. Broken and shattered, the fragments of his life scattered around him. He didn't know how to move forward, how to rebuild, but he knew he had to try. For Martha, for Clara, for himself. The reckoning had come, but the wounds remained open, raw, bleeding. The confession came quickly. Under the weight of the overwhelming evidence, the jewelry, the remains, the location, Leon Dobbins confessed in detail. His voice was devoid of emotion, his demeanor cold and detached, as if recounting a mundane series of events. Detective Thorne sat across from him in the interrogation room, listening to the chilling account of obsession, rage, and calculated brutality. Dobbins recounted his obsession with Clara, his growing resentment towards Martha for interfering. In 1983, he waited in the parking lot in his maintenance van, the engine idling, the darkness concealing his intentions. He watched them take their smoke break near the dumpsters. He abducted them both at gunpoint, the silence of the night broken by their terrified screams. When Martha fought back fiercely, trying to protect Clara, he killed her in a sudden, uncontrollable rage. He beat her to death in the back of the van, his fists fueled by adrenaline and hatred. Using his access to the Midwest Provisions warehouse, he hid her body. He sealed her in the pickle barrel that same night, the brine preserving her remains, concealing his crime. He took Clara to the farm, the isolated location, the perfect prison. He held her captive in the cellar for several months, abusing her, torturing her, breaking her spirit. In his twisted mind, he had believed that she would eventually love him back. He eventually murdered her when he realized she would never reciprocate his obsession, when the risk of keeping her became too great. Strangling her in the cellar, he buried her in the wall, sealing his secret in the earth. The confession was grotesque, surreal, a testament to the depths of human depravity. Leon Dobbins was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and kidnapping, sentenced to life without parole. The trial was a media circus, the details of the case splashing across the headlines. The quiet regional manager, the seemingly ordinary man, was revealed to be a monster. Marcus Foster was publicly cleared, his name finally free from the shadow of suspicion. He apologized to Ethan, the guilt evident in his eyes, the regret for his silence, a heavy burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Ethan and Bill attended a joint funeral, finally laying Martha and Clara to rest. They stood side by side in the small cemetery in Kearney, the wind whipping across the open prairie. The silence was broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. They shared a moment of mutual forgiveness and relief. The guilt that had bound them together for 12 years was finally released. The past could not be changed, but the future was still unwritten. The aftermath of the investigation left Ethan adrift, disconnected from the world around him. The restlessness that had haunted him for so long was replaced by a quiet, profound emptiness. The fabrication shop, the noise, the distractions, it all felt meaningless now. He packed his car, the few belongings he owned fitting easily into the trunk. He was leaving Nebraska, the place that held nothing but pain and sorrow. He drove away, the landscape blurring past the window, the horizon stretching before him, vast and unknown. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do, but he knew he was finally free, free from the ghosts of the past, free from the silence that had defined his life. Driving towards the sunrise, a faint glimmer of hope ignited in his heart. The road ahead was long, uncertain, but for the first time in 12 years, he was ready to face it. He was ready to start a new life, to honor the memory of his mother and Clara by living the life they had been denied.